Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is the AP Government Test Review for Chapter 4, Voting and Elections. This is actually my second take since the bell rang. I could not get through it fast enough. But there is significantly more information. Ooh, I'm about to trip and kill myself. This is significantly more information than was in Chapter 4, so I'm going to try and get through it as fast as possible. But there's a lot of stuff to study. First off, this chapter we talked about political participation. Political participation are all the actions that individuals and groups use to support and influence the government, or to not support them, to try and influence government in a particular way away from what it is acting as. The most common form of political participation is voting. Out of all of this whole list, voting is the most studied, it's the most understood, and it's the most common because it's easy for people to do. Another common form of political participation is discussing politics or attending meetings, attending political meetings. Another way is forming interest groups. If you actually form an interest group or a political action committee, also known as a PAC, that's a pretty intense form of political participation, but joining them is another form of political participation. When you actually contact a public official, whether you write a letter, pick up the phone and call them, make an appointment with them, write them an email, those are all methods of political participation by contacting your representative. When you help an official campaign for election or for re-election, that is a form of political participation. You are directly supporting a representative. When you contribute money, that is also a form of political participation. Giving, instead of your time, giving your money to a candidate or to a party, you're participating. One of the higher forms of participation is running for office. If you are actually running for to be a representative of the people, that is a pretty top form of political participation. And protesting, letting people know that you are angry, you are annoyed about something, that is also a form of political participation. These are typically referred to as common or mundane or normal forms of political participation. There are also unconventional forms. The most common that we've seen in our history is violent protesting, particularly during the Vietnam era. And that actually had an influence on the government. It influenced LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, to not run for re-election. So that was an effective form of unconventional protest. There are other forms, like some people would say assassination is a form of unconventional protest. Rioting or actual outright rebellion and revolution, those are all forms of unconventional political participation. When we talk about political participation, it's closely linked to suffrage, which is the right to vote. And the people, all the people in a country that have the right to vote, they are known as the electorate. Those are the people that are qualified to vote. And our electorate has changed significantly throughout our country's history. You can see there's a lot of stuff that happened that changed the size and the nature of our electorate. Early on in 1800, one of the first changes was there were laws made to ban religious qualifications, property ownership, and tax payments. Those are all things you had to have in some states to be allowed to vote, and those were eliminated after 1800. After 1870, with the 16th Amendment, we see no more race disqualification. So after the Civil War, African Americans can no longer be disqualified from voting, though we're going to see that's a contentious issue. After 1920, there are no more gender disqualifications with the 19th Amendment, so women get the right to vote. In 1965, we see lots of problems have built up related to race disqualifications. Some states have found all sorts of manners to deny suffrage to black people. So no more. In 1965, they get rid of grandfather clauses. They get rid of white-only primaries. Get rid of literacy tests, which were all methods that states used to prevent black people from voting. And those were all those rules were gotten rid of with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we'll talk more about those in our later chapters. 1961, we see another constitutional amendment, the 23rd Amendment, again changing the electorate by giving Washington, D.C., allowing them to vote in the presidential election with 3 electoral votes. Another amendment, the 24th Amendment in 1964, eliminates poll tax as another method that states had come up with to try and deny people their suffrage. In fact, in 1966, 2 years later, all poll taxes are ruled unconstitutional in a court case, one of the few court cases you need to know for this chapter, Harper versus Virginia State Board of Elections. And then finally, the last big expansion of the electorate happened with the 26th Amendment in 1971, when the minimum voting age was lowered to 18. So those are all significant expansions of the electorate and the expansion of suffrage. When we talk about all these people who are getting the right to vote, in some states we see we see an increased trend in issue voting. In the 20th century, we've seen with the progressive movement, it has led to greater forms of direct participation, getting citizens to actually participate in government. And there are several methods of direct participation: direct primary, recall, referendum initiatives. Direct primary, this is when, during the primary season, when citizens are allowed to help nominate candidates. That is a form of direct participation. Some states allow their voters to hold recall elections, which are elections to remove public officials before their term of office expires. We also see referendums in some states where citizens can vote on propositions, which are laws or amendments to their state constitutions. In some states, we also see initiatives, which are petitions to propose issues to be voted on as referendums, and of course those are put forward by voters as well. They're both forms of direct participation. But please remember, all of these right here are only at the state level. You will not see them at the national level. There are no national recalls or national referendums. These are only at a state level and only with some states. Who votes? All this issue voting and all this suffrage, all these people have the right to vote. Well, who actually goes out and votes? There are many factors that affect your likelihood of voting, including education, which is the top issue. That's why I've circled it. The education is the biggest factor that helps us to determine who is going to go vote. People with zero education or who high school dropouts, they are very unlikely to vote compared to people who get upper levels of education like doctorates. Closely related to education is income and occupation. If you have a high income, if you have a very prestigious occupation or profession, you are much more likely to go vote than somebody who works at Dairy Queen. Age, older people tend to vote much more often than younger people. Race, we see white people tend to vote more than minorities, though that is also closely linked to education and income, so your race doesn't matter if you have a higher education or income. Gender, in recent years we started to see women voting more than men. With religion, religious people who attend church or temple or synagogue or mosque more often are much more likely to vote than people who don't go as often or just don't attend religious services. That's a big impact. Marital status. People who are married tend to vote more than people who are single. People who are union members. Union membership, if you are a union member, then you're more likely to vote than non-union members. People who have a strong identity with their community. If you feel like you have a bond in your community, you're more likely to go vote. Same with the party. If you identify yourself strongly with one party, whether Republican or Democrat, or a third party, you're much more likely to go vote than somebody who's independent. Geography also plays a big impact. If you live in a swing state, you're more likely to go vote than somebody who lives in a state that is historically Republican or historically demographic, just because you know which way it's always going to go. But with all these people we see voting, we historically see large amounts of very low voter turnout, though that's not as common in certain elections, what people consider important elections, where there are critical issues up for vote. Then people will tend to go vote for those. Same with presidential elections. Presidential elections always draw more people to the polls. But there's lots of reasons that have been identified for that turnout is so low in America. One of the reasons is that with the 26th Amendment, the expansion of the electorate, we added in a whole bunch of people, 18-year-olds, a whole bunch of young people who don't go vote. And that significant voting block, when you expand the electorate but those people don't go vote, it leads to low voter turnout. We also have seen in numerous elections the failure of the parties to motivate the voters to get out and vote. And if you're not motivated, if you don't feel like the election affects you, you're probably not going to go to the polls. When people don't see a difference in the candidates, when you feel like you're voting for the lesser of two evils, you're probably just going to avoid the polls. When people mistrust the government, if you have an apathy for politics, if you don't care about politics or politicians or elections, you're probably not going to vote. People